to go.
Cool!
Hey everyone, it's 𝗧𝗪𝗀, and welcome back to another installment of my review series, where I give my own personal input and critique about a game I finished. And for this episode, we're finally going to break down my personal thoughts on Sonic X Shadow Generations. Ooh man, that name is still just But in all seriousness, usually this is where I get into a whole basic summary of my mindset going into a game, but it isn't necessary here, since I've basically been covering this game from the moment it was first announced. It's probably the most I've speculated and talked about a Sonic game through its pre-release period in ages. And it really is just because it's a Sonic game where for once I felt a strong confidence from Sega themselves again. Because as I broke down in my video about the trailers for Shadow Generations, every trailer felt like it was getting more and more interesting, and the game didn't feel overly sanitized or painfully bog standard and boring, which is an impressive feat, given that this is not only another Sonic game that does rely on older content, but it's a game where one half is this weird Shadow the Hedgehog campaign adventure that could have been about as half-assed as episode Shadow and Sonic Forces for all we know, and the other half is freaking Sonic Generations, a Sonic game that I really do like, but is a game I am so tired of because of how Sega has used its assets and content beats for more than a decade now. Like, this game had the means to set off all of my Sonic red flags, yet it didn't. Because something in my gut was saying that this was different. Could it be my 2000s era Sonic nostalgia being tickled? Or delusions of Sonic getting better finally going into full effect? Maybe it could have been. Yet, I don't think so. Because even when compared to the last 3D installment, Sonic Frontiers, I did not feel this way. But it's time to stop being vague and get into what I think about the game, starting with the boring part of this discussion, which is the Sonic Generations remaster. And you're all more than free to skip ahead of this with timestamps if you just want me to get into Shadow Generations already, which is basically the true meat of this discussion. But really, I'm not even going to spend too much time on this, as obviously, coming off the disaster that was Sonic Colors Ultimate, a remaster that some fans claimed was overly hated, but was actually one of the most embarrassing low points in the franchise in my eyes, I was worried for this. And it was kinda sad that I had to be, because remastering and bringing over a game like Sonic Generations really shouldn't be hard, given that it is a newer Sonic release that was pretty compatible with modern PCs. Even though the game is freaking 10 plus years old. Jeez man, I'm old. But in the end, Sega was able to decently port over the game, but I feel like it was only because of how minimal they touched up the game. Because yeah, to be honest, this is basically still Sonic Generations. There's no crazy graphical touches and adjustments that make you feel like you're playing an entirely different game. It's just straight up Sonic Generations. And people have noticed an increase in more minor bugs and weird glitches, which is definitely a shame and something Sega needs to address and improve on. But besides that, the game functions about identically to the original. One of the only other gameplay additions I can think to remember being, of course, the drop dash, because it basically gets added to every mainline Sonic thing these days. But this is a game where it feels extremely useless, as classic Sonic's spin dash in this game goes crazy fast by itself, and modern Sonic has the instant boost, so there's really no point in using it. Especially because of the fact that Sonic Generations is not as momentum based in physics as Sonic Mania. I guess there's also these Chow missions that are basically a nothing burger new collectible. I have no thoughts on those. And weirdly, they apparently adjusted some of the red ring positions in levels. Like, it's not necessarily a change I hate per se, but why though? So if we were just talking the Sonic Generations portion, it would be hard for me to say much else on it, because most of the changes around the game itself are just pure nothingness to me. And it's a bit frustrating to see, because I do think there was potential in a legit Sonic Generations remaster. One that maybe adds more levels, elements from the game's 3DS version, or what about the ability to play as other characters, since we have Shadow Generations? Like, would it have been so hard to allow Shadow as an alternate character in Sonic Generations, just without the fancy new gameplay things from Shadow Generations? Or heck, what if we got some sort of new final campaign that replaced the trash Time Eater boss fight with an actually cool set of final levels where you switch between Sonic, Classic Sonic, and Shadow, and then face a new version of Time Eater at the very end? But alas, that's crazy pipe dream stuff, and the actual changes to Sonic Generations are just whatever in terms of gameplay. Though I do want to give some comments on the story changes to the game, which I feel a lot more than indifferent towards, as I think these changes are kinda executed pretty badly. Now, the idea of rewriting Sonic Generations as a whole isn't bad to me on paper, as I think the original story not only wastes a lot of the potential with its concept, but it's obviously hurt by the 2010 era writing standards, that mentality of toning down on story and characters because of the negative mindset towards Sonic after the latter 2000s. But the way it goes about handling it is so minimal, it holds no real weight. The cutscenes are barely changed and mostly follow the structure of the original games, which is bad because sometimes characters will say these new things in the dialogue, but you can tell that it was not the original intention of the game at all. And it comes off as even more jarring as they do re-record the lines, but man, you can feel the difference between the old voice acting and the new voice acting, because I feel like this game's redubbed lines, more than anything, show off why I had that mindset that the 2010 era Sonic cast did not improve over the years. Something I'm not going to get into any further, because Sonic voice acting debating at this point is a mess. I'm toning down on that in the future. But in terms of the quote-unquote controversial changes, I don't freaking know. On one hand, I think a change like Knuckles not getting punked by Amy with a shove and mentioning the time stones is harmless, but a change like continuing the trend of toning Amy's crush on Sonic down is kinda just blah to me. And then there's just stuff I'm surprised people even noticed and made a big deal out of, like the whole Rouge censorship thing. Like guys, I just do not care about anthropomorphic backpack that much. We should honestly be thankful Rouge even still exists in these games with her classic design in any form. So yeah, I have nothing more to say on Sonic Generations in Sonic X Shadow Generations. It's mostly the same game with some changes I like, changes I don't like, but nothing to really go crazy about in a positive or negative way. But it's time for what you're all really here for, which is Shadow Generations. And right off the bat, my respect for this game was high because it really does not have any shame in acknowledging Shadow's entire history as a character. The recap animation you can play before starting up the game pretty much nails everything about his backstory clearly and doesn't shy away from addressing how tragic it was. And then when you get into the main game, the opening cutscene not only looks really good, but it actually feels very heartfelt and well directed, as the parallel between Shadow being awakened on the Ark and him being on the Ark in modern times is so good. Plus, I like his casual talk with Rouge, but how he's still very determined to eliminate whatever new threat he's dealing with. But we'll get more into the story and presentation in a bit. First, we gotta talk about that gameplay. So obviously, it's well documented that when it came to the gameplay of this game, I was not confident in it at all, as many people figured out pretty quickly that this was likely running on the Hedgehog Engine 2 and was going to have very similar physics and momentum to Sonic Frontiers. And again, since I never covered Frontiers in full, my thoughts on that game aren't the clearest. But what's relevant in terms of this discussion is that while I think Sonic's control in the open zone areas weren't so bad, his control in the cyberspace, which acted more like the traditional Sonic levels of that game, were so painfully flawed, due to the fact that the gameplay mostly took from Sonic Forces. And long story short, yeah, I don't like Forces very much, because I think it's a game that fumbled the boost formula gameplay to an embarrassing degree, by leaning into the worst elements of it without adding any sort of improvements, which just never made sense to me when previous games got it so right. Like, it's no secret that I don't think Sonic Unleashed and Generations are my ideal way for how I would like 3D Sonic to control, due to how stiff Sonic can feel in those games sometimes, since the games focus so much on, well, boosting mostly. But Generations and Unleashed still felt solid enough in their gameplay to where I could still respect the boost formula for what it was, and appreciate the strengths of it. Forces just made me so sick of it. And even though the open zone gameplay of Frontiers had some adventure formula inspired elements I would hope an open world Sonic game leans into more, the fact that so much of the game's template for the gameplay took from Forces hurt it a lot. So going into Shadow Generations, I was expecting that I would hate the general gameplay so much that it would drag down the entire experience, like it did for Frontiers in many ways. Pretty much expecting more Forces type gameplay with no improvements. But somehow, for once, Sonic Team didn't fumble in the gameplay department and make the game feel worse than the previous installment. Because while Shadow Generations does build off the gameplay template of Forces and Frontiers, it just feels a lot smoother to control Shadow in this game than Sonic in those games. Now granted, let me say now that the general control still isn't perfect, as the 3D movement can still feel a little stiff at times to me, and I would much prefer his jump feeling lighter in weight and floatier than having to rely on the double jump. Especially since we're still missing some staple 3D Sonic mechanics the game should really bring back by now, like a better air dash and the ability to drift while running. But with how this game's control works on the Hedgehog Engine 2 level, it's so much more manageable than the garbage control of Forces and the cyberspace levels, and that's a plus in my eyes. But even though the game lacks some of those old 3D Sonic mechanics that could help make the gameplay more engaging, what helps this game out a lot is that this time, Shadow actually feels like a whole different character than Sonic, as he has Chaos Spear and Chaos Control, but they're actually mechanics that are a part of his base moveset and are common abilities that you use throughout all the levels to make the level design more interesting. Like, you actually have to time your usage with Chaos Control well sometimes to get to secret paths, and Chaos Spear is a way to make both enemy and level design interesting, since you sometimes need to fire them quickly with a button press while you're running or platforming. They're not mechanics that feel unnatural or undercooked like many past ones. These are abilities we know Shadow has had for years and just feel like a second nature gameplay element for once. Which is all I ever wanted, man. Because I can live with Shadow being a Sonic clone too sometimes, but it feels so satisfying to play a game where Shadow has his own unique vibe and gameplay again. And even though I don't think every character needs something like Chaos Control or especially Chaos Spear in their gameplay, as those are things more connected to Shadow, I do hope that future games continue to nail giving other characters their own unique vibe in both gameplay and level design, while having a great sense of speed. But that gets into what was the more uncertain territory of this game for me, which is the Doom powers, due to how they gave off a vibe similar to the Wisp and the Chaos Emerald powers in Sonic Superstars, where they would feel extremely situational throughout the levels. But after replaying this game's level so much, no, these Doom powers feel like actual extensions to Shadow's base moveset as well. Not only because of how the levels heavily encourage their usage with each new stage that you'll unlock with them, but because they also tie into other areas of the game, such as the boss fights and even the game's main hub world. Though granted, some powers are better than others, and overall, they're pretty simple in nature. Like, Doom Spear is basically just an upgrade to the Chaos Spear. Doom Blast, while extremely satisfying to use when it's available, could have maybe done some cooler things with allowing Shadow to teleport and attack. And the wings are basically just a glorified super form equivalent with free movement control, which made it baffling that it was one of the earlier Doom powers we get, and then it just disappears until you get close to the finale. Weird. And as for Doom Morph and Doom Surf, while they had their fun moments and are overall non-intrusive, they felt a bit clunky, and I would much rather prefer to run on water, on foot, or traverse that type of terrain through some other type of way. But overall, I thought the Doom powers were really solid, because the level design just accommodates for them all pretty well mostly. There's no power that feels like it's 100% useless. So with that, how do I feel about the overall gameplay? Well, as much hate as someone like Prem gets for his Sonic takes and statements, his words on how he feels like Shadow Generations was basically a better version of Sonic Colors is pretty spot on to me. Because the game is overall solid in the gameplay, like in Sonic Colors, but unlike with that game, where it relied a bit too much on the Wisp and their very situational and one-note uses, everything about Shadow's abilities here just blends together naturally and doesn't feel too disconnected. But it's specifically compared to Colors, because while we improve from the actual mediocrity and trash that the gameplay of Forces and Frontiers could feel like at times, there's still room to get better, such as with those missing in action 3D Sonic mechanics I mentioned, and the overall physics and momentum. And especially when it comes to the 2D gameplay still, because I know how the 2D in this game doesn't feel insufferable, and people are now more open to 2D existing alongside 3D gameplay in 3D Sonic games again and all. But I'm sorry, especially because of how satisfying it was for this game to do what Sonic Generations should have done and had the 3D levels be actually fully 3D. This just makes me want 3D Sonic to mostly be 3D again even more. Because I'm sorry, I am so over 2D sections in 3D Sonic games, and I'm not budging on that. But if we are stuck with them because of whatever reasons, then fine. Keep their quality as consistent as the 2D levels in this game, because overall they are still really good, but actively improve the physics and momentum to feeling more like the classic Sonic style 2D gameplay. Now though, let's get on the presentation front. And I'll be pretty brief here and say that I think this game has some of the best presentation that a Sonic game has had in years. Because not only do I think it just balances the cartoony elements of Sonic's art styles and characters with realistic environments and textures better, but the overall smooth animation and cutscenes is such a warm welcome after the boring, stiff cutscenes we've dealt with for so long. Like, the increased amount of action and character movement in this story is great. And it's good to see characters get into some scuffles outside the gameplay, and it's nice to see the characters have some proper emotion in their faces. Basic bare minimum stuff that I want to see in the presentation for a new Sonic game. So all I ask is that this be kept up with future releases, because while I do think that Sonic could still improve in having a more distinct and polished visual art direction, I think this ground we have now is satisfying enough for me, and I'll take that with no complaints. In terms of the world category, honestly, the big surprise for me here is the white space open zone, because I was 100% expecting it to be a glorified menu again, like in the original Sonic Generations white space. But it leans more into feeling like this open playground with little secrets and mini challenges hidden around that you can explore freely however you want, as you unlock more stages, giving it this 𝗕𝗲𝗃 Fury type feel. Which again, it is just so amusing to me how this game feels like it executes the ideas that Sonic Frontiers was trying to do so much better. There's no annoying pop-in, there's no weirdly unfitting Among Us task feeling challenges, and there's no overabundance of dang 2D sections, which you already know just makes me happy. The main thing that stops me from saying it's a peak Sonic hub world is just that at the end of the day, it's still white space, a very empty void type world that doesn't naturally connect all these levels to each other. But on the subject of those said levels, how did I feel about each one? Honestly, I have not much to say that other people already haven't. Space Colony Arc is both a great intro stage and an overall solid and replayable Sonic level. Rail Canyon is as annoying as ever, but me not messing up the grind rail mechanics makes it easier, though I do think Sonic should make grinding a little more interesting again still. Kingdom Valley here is hands down one of the best Sonic stages ever and finally does justice to this level and its aesthetic. Sunset Heights gives us a glimpse into a Sonic Forces that actually put in good effort, and it makes me kind of sad. And then Chaos Island was the Sonic stage of all time for me at first, especially since I think it doesn't belong in this game and was only here for easy asset reuse, but it kind of grew on me. It mainly just took some getting used to with that dang Doom morph, so clunky. And then last but certainly not least, Radical Highway, Black Doom's favorite stage. The final Radical Highway level was great, and the overall Radical Highway segments were fun and all, but yeah, it was definitely overused and did not fit as the game's final level. We really should have gotten something from Shadow the Hedgehog 05, like Black Comet. And that's really my only problem with the levels of this game. They're all really fun and good, but they just left me wanting more, especially with those bite-sized mini-challenge levels. However, we've now arrived to the story segment of Shadow Generations, and this is where things can get spicy when it comes to my thoughts on a Sonic game, because we know Sega's track record. But how do I feel with this game? Well, it's complicated. Because while I think this game does a lot right for a Sonic story for once, I feel like it's really held back by the fact that this adventure is so heavily connected to Sonic Generations, which is a game that literally does not care about story. So it leaves a lot of wasted potential. Like, I love the fact that Shadow gets to reconnect with Maria and Gerald thanks to these time travel shenanigans, only to be separated from them again for the greater good. I like that Black Doom is not the mindless villain that I thought he'd be, and actually has a clear goal with what he's trying to do with Shadow. I even like his little moments with Rouge. But really, that's all I can say. This story is another one that relies so much on the past that it doesn't leave much room for too many of its own standout moments. Because while the highs of this game's story are really high, they just tread on familiar ground a lot, and it's not even really the game's fault this time, as that's just something you naturally have to do when you're directly connected to Sonic Generations. I especially think the whole Sonic and Shadow fake Chaos Emerald plotline felt a bit rough. Like, how on earth do you expect me to believe they swapped the Chaos Emeralds on Sonic's quick-moving self? How the heck is the fake Chaos Emerald even still on the Ark? And also, that cutscene where Sonic and Shadow meet is just so forced in its dialogue and why they fight. I'm sorry. But yeah, overall, I think the story did the best they could with what they had, but man, did it leave me wanting more, especially with the other side characters, as I basically forgot Rouge and Omega were here almost, and why the heck are Big, Orbot, and Q-Bot here? Well, I guess Big was MIA in the original generation, so it was nice that he finally got to be included in some form, but Orbot and Q-Bot with their dumb side quests were so pointless. I think these characters at least could have played a part in mini missions or something, like what if Omega helped you shoot stuff, or Rouge helped you in a few missions. Like, man, again, a lot of wasted potential. But to wrap up this talk on characters and story, let's talk about those bosses. And really, for once again in a Sonic game, the bosses were some of the best highlights. And I think they're some of the most satisfying bosses to fight in the series, as not only do they have decent attacks to dodge, a great fast flowing pacing to them, and some really cinematic moments, but I really like how well connected they are with Shadow's base moveset abilities. The Bio-Lizard fight was really good, though the in-game cover of Supporting Me not having lyrics was a baffling choice. Like, seriously, what the heck happened? They were perfect in the Doom Powers trailer. Metal Overlord was honestly the weakest fight, due to how it's almost entirely on Doom Surf and feels nothing like the original Metal Overlord fights. But don't get me wrong, it's still okay as a boss, as hearing Metal actually fully talk again and using Chaos Control against you was pretty crazy. It's just, I feel like this fight could have been better. And yes, I know it's kinda lame to see a character this powerful turned into an easy low stakes boss, so that would bother me too, but again, this is Generations. And Mephiles. Oh man, Mephiles. I was kinda scared on how they would execute him given how long he's been gone and how weird everything with Sonic 06 is, but his fight was pure perfection, as they not only respect the fact that he was canonically wiped away from existence, but make him appear to be in this insane state due to being trapped in eternal paradox purgatory, which is an extremely fitting fate for him if you ask me. I know people have said that this could be great setup for him returning, but this works better as a satisfying conclusion for the character in my eyes. But since this is Sega we're talking about, who knows? Maybe this is set up for him being in Sonic Frontiers 2 or something. Finally though, Devil Doom and Neo Devil Doom. Oh man. This overall fight honestly might just be one of the best final bosses in the Sonic franchise, because of how it doesn't feel like a fight that comes out of nowhere. Like, everything about this fight was perfectly set up, between needing to use almost all of your Doom powers during the entire boss battle, the way Black Doom taunts Shadow about how he's gotten stronger because of how Shadow has gotten stronger, and the music, bro. Oh my goodness, the music. The remix of Black Doom's battle theme is already really good, but the fact that we finally get a Sonic game that ends on a final boss with some Crush 40 again, it just genuinely put so much life back into my soul. Though the fight ending on just Shadow with the Doom Wings did feel a bit anticlimactic, as man, I really wanted to play as Super Shadow again. Which I know that wouldn't be possible thanks to Sonic having the Chaos Emeralds in regular generations, but they could have at least made him remove his limiter rings or something for that extra hype. Although apparently there was dialogue explaining that Shadow would overpower and explode if he did that, but blah, lame. But yeah, really, just like with the stages, the only problem I have with the bosses is that I wanted more of them. I'm sorry, I'm greedy, I know. But you can't deny that this game had missed opportunities to do more. For example, I just think it's weird how we get this whole showdown cutscene with Sonic, but it doesn't go into a boss fight. It could have been a nice parallel to Sonic and Shadow's original SA2 fight, where now we can see Shadow take on Sonic and win. Though granted, he would probably still lose in the cutscene because plot, but still. And of course, that ML fight in Dark Beginnings gaslighted us so hard. An ML fight could have been so cool, but he's not here. Heck, I know what I said about not wanting to see Infinite's lame self, but now that I see how well these bosses were done, I think this could have been a chance for even him to get some redemption, especially since we have a Forces stage in the game. I just didn't want to see the Deadly Six's ugly faces 100%, because, you know, go away forever, 𝗧𝗏𝗃. But okay, we're getting closer to the end here, so let's touch up on music. And this is an area of the game that seems like it's one of the most divisive areas, as the soundtrack of another Sonic game is once again a mixed bag here. Because there'll be some amazingly rocking or very fitting remixes to the levels of this game, but then of course there's the endless EDM remixes. And if you follow my thoughts on this, you'll know that while I don't hate EDM as a genre, and think Sonic has produced some solid EDM songs, I do think that these types of remixes are overstaying their welcome, and if they are going to continue, they need to be more stylized. Like, Shadow having EDM music overall makes a little sense, since his music style in SA2 could lean into a type of electronic music at times, but his style of it actually fit his character in that game because of the whole dark and subdued tone to it. It didn't have obnoxious loud dubstep type beats running throughout most of the songs, and I feel like that's why the EDM has been so hit or miss with these recent Sonic OSTs. So because of this, I have to agree that this is one of the weaker mainline Sonic OSTs, though not necessarily the worst mainline one, I'd say. Games like frickin' Sonic 4 exist after all. And definitely not the worst overall Sonic OST. Games like Sonic Chronicles exist after all. Just a pretty below average range one. And usually I'd spend some time on a bonus section next, but I don't have much to say with this game in terms of any bonus content. I think the journal pages are cool and give some really crazy details about the extended Sonic lore. I like some of the unlockable artwork you can get in the game, as I was pretty surprised to see freaking Sonic X art jump scare me. And the unlockable music for stages is a godsend for the stages that do have those less favorable level remixes. So with that, we now arrive at my summary and final verdict. And really, I just think that this was a very solid Sonic experience all around for what it is. There's definitely still stuff I want Sega to improve in future titles, and I want some more of the general 3D Sonic mechanics to return, but overall, I can't think of really any major issues with this game. My biggest problems with it really do come from the fact that this is another Sonic game that has its structure based on generations. But honestly, maybe this is what the franchise needed, because this is the best Sonic game since the original Sonic Generations, and it's almost not even close. As even though I do think a game like Mania does some things better in terms of the gameplay, this game gets far more respect from me for acknowledging the entire history and identity of the franchise, and not just the Genesis era, which is something I've been waiting for since, again, the original Sonic Generations. It's just so nice to have a Sonic game that didn't have any weird catches or misleading red flags in its pre-release, and then the final game itself also delivered as well. So because of how satisfying I think Shadow Generations is, and how I think being paired with the original Generations makes it an even sweeter deal, I'm honestly and genuinely going to give this game a very high B+, which I know. I can already see some of my followers thinking this is a crazy grading, given how critical I've been towards the series on this channel. But I don't solely factor in other people's feelings for how I feel about a game. What matters most is what the experience made me feel. And while I don't think Sonic X Shadow Generations as an overall package was perfect, this is undeniably one of the best Sonic games released in ages, and it makes me happy to see the series on good footing again. But now, that's going to get into our future segment, where I talk about what I want this game to lead into, which means what I want to see for the future direction of the Sonic series. And man, Look, Sega, I know I'm a picky guy, so I don't always seem like the most reasonable Sonic fan to listen to, but I need you guys to listen to my advice for this one time, because there are a lot of things you need to take from Sonic X Shadow Generations. Firstly, I hope Sega doesn't just attribute the game's success to the holidays or the hype around the movies, as while those things definitely will help this game's sales performance, it's not what is putting Sonic back on people's radars again. People are respecting this game because it is a solid and polished experience that executes its ideas and concepts really well. While there's many things I've disagreed with when it came to the games between OG generations and Shadow generations, the main issue has just been that lack of polish from the original generation's game. It's just so satisfying to play another game that feels on par with the original generations again, but it's also so frustrating. Because think of how hard Sonic Team could have been cooking all this time if they weren't goofing off for the entire 2010 era. This game feels like the spiritual sequel to Sonic Generations we should have got back in 2017. Because for as much as I hated how much Forces tried to rely on Generations and the boost formula for 3D Sonic as a whole alone, I would have respected it more if the quality were at least on par with those games. A game that feels like it's improving off one of the best Sonic games instead of games that abandons its setup for random Mario fan pandering like in Sonic Lost World, a failed rebrand that tried to shun the franchise's identity while also nearly sinking the franchise into $20 million debt, or a game that tries to appeal to everyone but appeals to no one because of how crippled Sonic Team became after Sonic Boom flopped on its face, aka Sonic Forces. Like, imagine if Sonic Team was moving like this in all that time they spent bullshitting throughout the 2010 era. And early 2020 Sonic era, you're not safe either, because even though this game owes a lot to Sonic Frontiers in many ways, it also feels a part of this wasted potential. Because again, it feels like this franchise was barely functioning off the budget it had after what Sonic Boom did, so even though Frontiers had a lot of ambition, it was never going to live up to it all when it was reusing so many flawed gameplay elements from Sonic Forces, and was overall another misguided game that feels like it was trend chasing after Breath of the Wild, instead of getting Sonic back on his own 2 feet first. Which is why I really like Sonic X Shadow Generations. It's the first Sonic game in years that basically just feels like another Sonic game. Not a game trying to appease to just one subsection of the series, not a game trying to appeal to a whole different audience, and not a game that feels like a soulless cash grab. It's a game with some actual soul in it. And that's all I wanted, man. That is literally all I wanted. Like, is it so hard to ask that this be kept up consistently, Sonic Team? Why does it need to be rocket science to understand what makes Sonic work when this game shows off perfectly you've been capable of doing it all this time? Again, man, it's so frustrating. But yeah, if we get more 3D games, I hope they take a lot of cues from the main 3D levels of Shadow Generations, but bring back those more in-depth 3D Sonic mechanics and focus less on using the boosting as a clutch. It's just how I personally feel. I would say that I want 2D sections gone too still, but yeah, I could see those going nowhere. But this was a game that actually felt like it had more 3D gameplay than 2D gameplay for once, so I at least asked that we stay on this level. You know, have the main set piece stages mostly in 3D with a lot of alternate paths. Maybe have a few fully 2D levels to help with extending the playtime if they're truly necessary, working on making them feeling more satisfying in control in the process. If you do all that, that'll be fine for me. And of course, take the boss battle designs of this game into the next one too, as I love the great mix of simple gameplay mechanics with the more cinematic cutscene aspects. I know some people somewhat miss the combat of Sonic Frontiers, and I'm also open-minded to that returning, but I wouldn't mind this standard of Sonic combat either. Yet I think most importantly of all, we really need a fully original Sonic game again, as it was nice to see characters like Mephiles, Maria, and all of them again, but it's really time for this series to tell some fully original new stories. I want to see a stage lineup of all original levels, unless a returning level or location is believably relevant to the main story or is heavily different. No Green Hill Zone, no chemical plant, no Sky Sanctuary, and as cool as it was for this game, no Radical Highway. Let's cook with maybe a few familiar general themes, but entirely new environments and set pieces, please. Thank you very much. I also want new characters in these new stories, but I do not mind returning characters if they're a part of the main cast. Like characters such as Cream, Big, Team Chaotix, Omega, Metal Sonic, and etc. I do not mind coming back because I consider them core cast characters. Heck, I even welcome a few one-shot characters returning if they can contribute something interesting to a new story. But with characters like Maria, Gerald, and heck, even Black Doom somewhat, I feel like you've maxed out all you can with them for now. So really do just focus on that balance between new characters and the core cast. And yeah, the music could be better, and it really just comes down to needing to tone down on the dang EDM, please. But really, that's pretty much it for what I've got to say. I think the future of this franchise looks bright once again, but it heavily relies on Sega keeping up the momentum. Look at everything that worked about this game and keep it. Do everything in your power to make sure the talented people who helped create this game stay by your side. Treat them with respect and give them all the necessary time they need to put out a good project. And if you can at least do that, I think Sonic can finally consistently grow as a franchise with no stumbles. But only time will tell if that's the path we'll head on, or if we'll be back to square one. So until we find out, I'm out of here. If you've made it to this point of the video, thank you for watching all the way until the end. What are your thoughts on Sonic X Shadow Generations? Do you think this game finally sets up a consistent positive direction for the series? Or will we be back to... you know what I'm referring to. Just let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to leave a like on it, subscribe to the channel if you are new to it, and follow my additional social media in the description for more content and updates. This has been 𝗃𝗧, and I'm out. Peace.